Is it true that an egg can reveal something about our lives? That's the age old question, isn't it? The fascination really does span cultures and it spans centuries, but it's not always about a literal reading. It's about tapping into the symbolic language. So it's less about the egg itself and more about what the egg formations actually represent. It's like a language. Once you understand the symbols, then you can start to see how they might relate to your own life and how you might see them. Let's look at it like peeling back layers of an onion. Let's start with the external, things like gossip or outside influences that might be impacting us. Glass one is our first layer. And the first clue, air bubbles. Think about it, air bubbles are air, and air is often associated with communication, with words, with gossip. Okay, so bubbles in the surface of the water after a cleansing could mean people are gossiping about you. This video is not going to talk about how to do the ritual. This is exactly after you complete the ritual. If you do want me to make a video about Santa Muerte's help in doing the ritual, please let me know in the comments. But for now, we're going to be looking at it as if we see bubbles, and that means people are talking about you. That's a very, very common interpretation. And there's some interesting nuances to it. Eliseo Torres, in his book Curandero, A Life in Mexican Folk Healing, talks about how those bubbles can symbolize negative energy being directed toward somebody. But how do you know if it's just harmless chatter or if it's a little more serious than that? Well, that's where paying attention to detail is really important. The size and quantity of the bubbles can sometimes give you a better sense of what's going on. Like, for example, what would a bunch of tiny bubbles mean versus one big bubble? Is there a difference? Huge difference. Small bubbles might indicate that there's a lot of people talking, maybe spreading rumors or just kind of gossiping idly. But a large bubble, particularly if it's surrounded by smaller ones, might suggest there's one main instigator, someone who's influencing others' opinions. It's like the bubbles are telling a story, and it's all about interpreting the language. We've got the outer layer, the air bubbles, the gossip. What's next? As we move deeper, we start to encounter symbols that represent more direct influences. Imagine you crack open the egg and you see threads rising from the egg. The shape of those threads is really important and significant. Sharp, needle-like threads have often been associated with masculine energy, whereas rounded threads are linked with feminine energy. So if you're seeing pointy threads, does that mean you have a male enemy? Yeah, that's one way to look at it. It speaks to the idea of a potential adversary, someone who might be intentionally directing negative energy your way. But again, it's not about taking it literally, it's about understanding the underlying symbolism. Then rounded threads would be like a feminine energy. But are these interpretations set in stone? What if you don't necessarily subscribe to traditional gender roles? It's a great question, and it highlights a really important point that these are traditional interpretations. And often they're rooted in very specific cultural contexts. They're not meant to be rigid or limiting, and they certainly might not resonate with everybody. Trust your gut, consider the symbolism, but don't be afraid to apply your own understanding to it as well. There's always room for personal interpretation. All right, so we're moving deeper into the egg, further into this metaphorical onion. What's the next layer? This is where we start to get into the realm of deeper, more subtle energies, things that may not be immediately obvious, but can still have a really big impact. Think cobwebs. Cobwebs are creepy enough in real life, but in an egg cleansing, what's that all about? It's about what cobwebs represent. Entanglement. They catch things, they cling, they trap things. Not exactly the vibe you want in your energy field. So seeing those web-like threads in the egg, especially if they're intricate or feel particularly dense, could be a sign of what Sandra Ingerman calls spiritual intrusion. She wrote in Soul Retrieval, Mending the Fragmented Self, that it's a sign to look a little deeper. Spiritual intrusion, not just everyday negativity, but it's something deeper. It might be that you're holding on to old patterns, old beliefs, or maybe even energies from other people that aren't serving you anymore. Cobwebs, in this context, are like a wake-up call, like a sign to do some deeper work. It's like saying, hey, there's some stuff here that needs your attention. So you begin getting a new appreciation for the symbolism here. We've gone from gossip to adversaries to some serious soul searching. Where do we go from here? Well, let's talk about the water itself. So far, we've been focused on the egg, but the water plays a role too, particularly when it changes color. What happens when the water turns dark? Don't get nervous, but darkness is often associated with the unknown, with heavy or stagnant energy. And in some traditions, murky water after a cleansing is linked to curses, hexes, or what some may call black magic. We're venturing into some intense territory here. But it's important to approach these interpretations with a balance of respect for tradition and a healthy dose of discernment, which is interesting, and it's a spectrum. So don't panic if the water gets a little dark, but also don't ignore it completely. Pay attention to how you feel, listen to your intuition. If something feels off, it's always wise to seek guidance from someone you trust. Ready to move on from the water back to the egg? Because we have more to uncover. Let's dive deep into the egg itself, specifically the yolk. This is where things can get really interesting visually speaking. Imagine cracking that egg and seeing the yolk looks cooked. If you're like, the yolk can cook? Yes, subscribe to my channel because I'll go deeper into why this is possible during the actual cleansing. But for now, let's look at it not as it being literally cooked. Let's think about it more about what the cooked appearance symbolizes, and that's fire. This just took an unexpected turn. Think about the nature of fire. It can transform, it can destroy, purify, but it can also rage out of control if it's not balanced. So now you start to see the connection, but how does this relate to the egg yolk specifically? Imagine that cooked appearance as this kind of sudden surge of energy that's being directed at you, like a burst of heat. It's a powerful symbol and it can be unsettling, to put it mildly, but it makes you wonder, where is that energy coming from? It feels different from gossip or even a directed attack like we were talking about earlier. And this is where personal interpretation and intuition are so important, because it's about asking yourself, what feels true for me at this moment? What resonates with my experience? So if someone sees a cooked yolk, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's definitely a sign to pay attention and reflect, because it's a call to explore what might be causing that intense energy. Is it something within you, something you're holding on to, or is it something external that needs to be addressed? So what's next? We're talking about double yolks now. I mean, you find a double yolk, you'd assume sometimes it's good luck, right? But it's more nuanced than that. In many cultures, dualities are seen as omens. Not always bad ones, like something's happening. So a double yolk is a powerful symbol of duality, of hidden layers, complexities. Think of it like this: when you encounter a double yolk during an egg cleansing, it suggests that there's more to the situation than meets the eye. Again, not necessarily positive or negative, but it definitely warrants further exploration. You've got to look a little deeper, ask more questions. So by now you may realize this isn't just about interpreting egg formations, but it's also about self-reflection and trusting your intuition, which honestly is probably a good takeaway regardless. What's next? Let's see, we've got another yolk formation, white markings. White markings on the yolk. So what could that possibly mean? Is that like a cosmic message to eat healthier? Perhaps, but in the context of an egg cleansing, it often points to something much deeper, a potential imbalance within the body. Not necessarily about what I'm eating, but about how my body is functioning overall. And yes, it speaks to the idea that sometimes physical symptoms are reflections of deeper imbalances that need to be addressed. So if somebody notices white markings, it's a good time to maybe consult a holistic practitioner, like someone that takes a more mind, body, spirit approach. That's one path you could take. There are many, but it's about taking control of your well-being, not just waiting for something to go wrong. It's being proactive. And speaking of being proactive, we need to talk about one scenario that signifies it's time to take things seriously, like medically speaking. Red dots on the yolk. And if to you that sounds a little more, urgent than the other formations that we've seen, you're picking up on the symbolism, which is excellent. Red is often associated with blood, with life force. And in many situations, seeing red in an egg cleansing is a sign to seek medical attention. It's literally the egg saying, hey, don't ignore this, go see a doctor. And it's a reminder that while these practices can be incredibly insightful, they're not replacement for professional medical advice. As we always hear, check with your doctor, check with your medical professional before starting any new practices. So if somebody listening, though, is skeptical and they're thinking to themselves, how can an egg possibly tell me anything about my health? Well, that's a valid question. And it highlights a really important point, which is that egg cleansing isn't about diagnosing illnesses in a medical sense, but it's about tapping into a different kind of knowledge, a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves. So it's about trusting that our bodies have ways of communicating with us, even if it's not always in a language that we immediately understand. And when those messages feel urgent, like in the case of red, that's when it's important to listen and seek appropriate help. We've covered a lot of ground here. We went from external influences to deeper and even potential physical health signals. It's clear that there's so much more to egg cleansing than what meets the eye. I find it fascinating, a whole world underneath the shells. So what happens when you're done the egg cleansing though? You've interpreted the signs and now you're left like, now what? You can turn to the purple Santa Muerte archetype for help and guidance. I'll put a link to my video explaining all the colors of her robes if you want to check that out. You can also do rituals with the appropriate candles. You can find that video also on my channel. Because again, that leads us to the final and perhaps most important aspect of egg cleansing, which is not just about interpreting the signs, but it's also what you do with that information. It's like we've been handed this map, but it's up to us to actually decide where we want to go from here. Because where does someone even begin to process all of this? Great question, especially if the egg cleansing has revealed something significant. Well, it circles back to that idea of trusting your intuition, that inner voice that's been guiding you all along, what feels right at this moment, and not necessarily about following a set of rules. Sometimes that guidance that you get leads you to seek support from others. It could be a trusted friend, a mentor, spiritual advisor, a higher being, a healer. It just depends on what feels right. But it's definitely about recognizing that we're part of this larger web of connection and support. We're not alone in this. And I think that's something really important to remember, especially when we're talking about practices like egg cleansing. It makes you realize that even though we're talking about something seemingly simple as an egg, we're actually talking about something much bigger. Like we're talking about our connection to something ancient, to something beyond ourselves. I think that's what makes these practices so enduring. They offer to us a way to connect with something bigger, to tap into this lineage of wisdom and belief that's been passed down through generations from our ancestors and the people that came before us. So it's both humbling and empowering at the same time. And I say humbling because it reminds us that we don't have all the answers, but empowering because it gives us these tools to navigate the unknown. It gives us a place to start. If you've gotten this far into the video, please like it and subscribe.